everybody. Hello. Everybody ready? Great. Thank you all for coming and welcome to the third of this year's seminar in the History of the Present series. Since 2020, I've been inviting speakers, and they have the task of bringing history to bear on the principal issues of the present. We've had all kinds of, quite a number of really quite famous people. Now, we've got one more event later on the 5th of May, which I know is more or less when your exams are starting, not that they are an important distraction, with Andrew Port on contemporary Germany's attitude to genocide, and I invite you to put it in your diary. But regarding today's talk, some of you may have noticed that democratic politics has become discontented over the last few years. It was an obvious topic to choose for this series this year, and I really couldn't think of anybody better to lead the discussion on this than our guest today, Martin Conway. Martin is a fellow of Balliol College, Oxford, and chair of the faculty board of the Department of History, which I'm assuming is the history department. And he becomes chair of this. I noticed he's got a few more grey hairs than he had last time I saw him, which may have something to do with the job. It's rejuvenating you, right? Okay, you're going against him. He's the author of a book on Western Europe's Democratic Age, 1945-1968, published by Princeton University Press, and The Sorrows of Belgium, which is OUP, right? 2012, among other books. And he's also, great minds think alike, one of the editors of Cambridge University Press series, Histories of the Present, together with Kieran, right? Yeah.
And Celia Donald.
All right, together with a couple of colleagues. Now, I was very interested to see that he's currently working on, and I quote here, a new project on political men, which seeks to problematize the forms of male political citizenship which have developed in Europe across the 20th century. Might have a few words about this at some point in the discussion. But at this point, I'd just like to say, Martin, welcome to Bologna. Maybe you can talk for 30 minutes or so, and then we'll throw open the floor to debate. I should say that in this room, I can see quite a number of people. I teach two courses, Intellectuals and Politics and Democracy and its Discontent. I can see a few Democrats and a few intellectuals in the audience, so you should have an audience that's receptive to your talk. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mark, and it's a pleasure to be here. And to have to speak about an easy question. Does democracy breed discontent? Yes, of course it does. You know, this is not a question upon which we need to labour the answer with a bit of yes and a bit of no and then some summary at the end. No, this is clearly the reality that for all political regimes, think of the Soviet Union by the 1990s, think of the Habsburg Empire by 1918, think of the way in which all regimes work in a certain way and for certain reasons, and then history moves on, and they no longer carry on working in the same way. And that's really what I would suspect has been happening to democracy over the last couple of decades in Europe. And gosh, thinking about tomorrow, perhaps in America too. So we're not confronted by a question that's difficult to answer, but we are confronted by an answer that's difficult to explain. We want to try to understand why democracy now produces a certain discontent within Europe in a way which was not the case hitherto. We always know people complained. We always know people thought their rulers were self-interested characters who shouldn't be trusted in any way. But that's not the same as feeling that democracy itself is not working. And democracy is, after all, supposed to be different from people like the Soviet Union or people like the Habsburg emperors. It's supposed to be a regime towards which European states tend to converge when there isn't anything in the way of that. the exceptions to democracy are often explained, especially by historians of the early 20th century, in terms of exceptions. A German exceptionalism, a German Sonderweg, as they like to call it, a German way in which somehow Germany had become different, which had prevented Germany from becoming democratic until 1945. It's that sort of exceptionalism which dominates the literature on this, with the assumption going on behind the whirring of the machine that it is the natural path of Europeans in the 20th century to converge on democracy. There's, of course, a certain air of European superiority going on there, and more especially a certain air of West European superiority going on there. And it's quite obvious in many of the European commentaries on Trump that it brings out not merely a rather cartoonish vision of somebody who is, in many ways, a rather serious political leader, but also a more general disdain somehow for the way in which American democracy works in comparison with European democracy. And it is also obvious that the optimism that was apparent in some European states or former empires in the post-war years, that democracy was a product for export outside of Europe, quite easily gets replaced by a certain sense that actually it's only really a certain sort of European who's suited for democracy. These are very rather murky assumptions that go on, I think, in the history of Europe after 1945. But the assumption is always that if you leave Europeans to their own devices, they will more or less end up in a regime of democracy. And part of the reason for that is clearly the extent to which democracy is seen as self-correcting. The way in which, unlike the authoritarian alternatives, be they of the left or right, democracy is a regime which adjusts to its milieu, to its circumstances, and which will actually deepen and improve over time. If you're in doubt about that sort of assumption, read what is in many ways one of the most influential books on this subject, which is Jeff Ely's Forging Democracy, which is a long-term history of democracy in Europe from the French Revolution to around the 1980s, which I find unsatisfying in many ways, but particularly for this assumption that democracy kept on getting bigger and better and deeper, or whatever adjective one might want to reach for. It's this sense that somehow democracy adapts to its circumstance. In Ely's case, he puts a great deal of emphasis on the inclusion of women, on the inclusion of non-European minorities and so on. But these are assumptions about how democracy somehow is a project which will always right itself and will always end up back in the right place, even if there are a few bumps in the road. It's what Mark has commented on in other contexts about the progressive narratives that dominate the history of Europe and Italy in the 20th century. But the last 20 to 25 years seem to me to disprove many of these sort of perhaps Euro-essentialist and optimistic narratives about the course of Europe at the end of the 20th century into the history of the present. Instead, we are confronted by a pervasive language of crisis, which is made the title of books, made the title of radio programs, made the title even of courses in universities. That there is a crisis of democracy is an assumption which one finds everywhere and which therefore is rather tempting to knock down. It's easily overstated. It's turned into a kind of self-justifying commentary where you can find symptoms of crisis when you go looking for them and you ignore the things that don't fit in with that sort of narrative. But the use of it is perhaps really quite interesting, because the optimism that had been very apparent in Western Europe after 1945, that somehow democracy had turned itself into an irreversible process, that there had been something approaching a conversion of West Europeans to democracy, not overnight in 1945, certainly not, but in something like, stick a pin in 1955 to 1970. Up until then, I think I would try to argue a case that Europeans didn't really care that much about democracy. By 1970, on the whole, they did. We can talk about the changes that might have brought that about. But the important thing was this assumption that this change had been irreversible. And that was put down to, yes, a change of heart on the part of Europeans, but also due to the success of democracy acting as a conveyor belt between the demands of the population, individual, but also especially in associational or sectional groups, and the actions of those in power, governments, civil servants, and the like. This was a democracy that listened, of course not perfectly, but that was responsive to popular demands, and a democracy that in some way was crafted to meet the shape of the society that had emerged in Western Europe after 1945. It was therefore a democracy very much based around men, to pick up on your other point, and it was a democracy based around inequality, but a measured inequality, the measured inequality of social class, rather than the polarization that you might see in some other societies in the world. So this was seen to be, especially once, as long as it provided a certain economic prosperity, to be a new regime that was irreversible in its fundamentals. And it takes a very long time for Europeans to begin to, well, for historians more exactly, to begin to recognize that this may never have been the case, or it certainly was no longer the case. So this use of the term crisis and the sort of alarm it seems to imply on the part of those seeking narratives of Europe from the 20th century into the 21st is, to me, very interesting. Crisis becomes this hinge whereby we try to understand how Europe shifted from its position around, let's say, 1990 or so, 1989-90, to the position around 2020. That in those 30 years, and you will live long enough to write the books on this, in those 30 years, you can see some sort of fundamental shift in the nature of European political debate and the extent to which a democracy that might have worked up until that point, with a few exceptions, no longer seems to work in the same way by the 2020s. Now, historians always live in the past. They're paid to do so. But what's interesting about this is that this is about living in a very particular past. And something that has concerned me quite a lot over recent years has been the reluctance of historians to do exactly what Mark has proposed with this series, which is to construct a sense of the history of the present. Historians find the 20th century, with all its very particular narratives, do I need to name them? 2 world wars, the Holocaust, the 1960s, and so on. We could all write a course proposal for a course on Europe in the 20th century at the drop of a hat. It's too familiar, it's too cozy, and I'm a bit alarmed by the reluctance of historians to engage in a discussion of what came next. Part of the reason why they're so invested in it is that I think there was a particular project of writing contemporary history in Europe that developed from the 1970s or so onwards that was essentially very well funded in areas of Germany, that produced a BMW generation of historians for whom the investment was in writing a particular history of the 20th century as the collapse into a year zero around the middle of the century, and about its rescue in the western half of Germany thereafter. And that rather optimistic narrative is something that I think still plays in many historians' minds about what we know about the 20th century. And conversely, a reluctance to embrace the present, what you might call an unfamiliar present, a present that doesn't fit with those 20th century narratives, and from which the BMW School of Historians feel a little bit alienated because it doesn't fit with narratives of increasing European integration, of cosmopolitanism, of increasing liberal social rights, of the development of a deeper, stronger democracy. They don't want to turn the page to that because it opens an awful lot of other rather more gloomy pages of European history. So they can only see the history of the present through the prism of crisis and decline. Now, they're not wrong to do so. There's much merit in that sort of indices of decline or indices of crisis approach to writing about the history of democracy in the early 21st century. And I think one can elaborate on them briefly for 5 minutes or so before I move on to, in terms of 4 headings, really. I mean, the first is the practice of democracy has clearly decayed in Europe, the formal practice of democracy, I should emphasize, in the last 20 or 30 years. Voter turnout declines, any sort of statistics or indices of civic participation have declined. Parliaments, in some sense, have become empty chambers. They don't seem to serve the same purpose in many European societies as they might formerly have done. Rulers seem to be bending democratic structures to their own purposes, and not only in Hungary. In that sense, there is a kind of broader executive recapture of the practices of democracy, which is probably more pervasive and more interesting than saying that it was all the work of evil people in Facebook or whatever. This is actually about something more profound, which is about a tension that has developed between the practice of democracy and the rituals and practices of daily life. And it has produced, of course, the ultimate error, the wrong people winning. And that's a very strong element of the disdain that many historians feel for the current situation. Britain was the market leader in this in terms of the election of a government that led through that enacted the catastrophe of Brexit. But that sense of having the wrong leaders is now very well spread across Europe and feeds into the gloomy accounts of the German election of 2025, which I didn't personally find very gloomy, and the French election of 2027, which is now seen as this great thing on the horizon, which, unless the judges manage to suffocate her in a tomb, will result in the election of Marine Le Pen as president. That sort of sense that somehow the practices of democracy have decayed to an extent where that needs to be talked about seems to me to be really rather worrying. And it's connected to my second theme about the decay of democracy, which is this contested field of legality. On the one hand, you have exponents of a certain democratic status quo or constitutional status quo taking refuge in legalistic procedures, not just Le Pen, but a whole series of other instances, including in Belgium, about not letting people win. And that's about privileging a legal process over a democratic process. And at the same time, you have a broader social erosion of the norms of legality, with the extent to which civil rights of various kinds, be they personal, gender-based, sexuality-based, race-based, that might have been thought to have been at least rather tentatively established in Europe around the 1990s, no longer seem to be capable of being defended. So you have this twin sort of legality gets stuck between these twin forces. A third symptom of decay is clearly something which I don't think many of us saw coming, which is a certain resurgence of executive power. Perhaps one wants to look here to the pandemic and to the extent to which it re-legitimized a certain spirit of government action ahead of the will of the people. But I think you also see it in debate about the current crises in Europe, be it trade wars or military wars. There's a willingness of states and indeed the European Union to run ahead of the popular will because of the needs of the moment, this sense that actually they have a higher understanding of the needs of the moment, and therefore they don't need to seek a democratic mandate for what they do. When will we see the first Europe-wide referendum on military rearmament? I don't think we'll see it at all. There is this reluctance to expose those sort of decisions to a broader decision-making process in a way which I don't think would have been the case 20 or 30 years ago. Think of those various referenda on the EU back in the 2000s. They didn't all end well, but there was a determination that actually some sort of will of the people was necessary for things to happen. The Belgians have it right. They outlawed referenda in their constitution. So there's this resurgence of executive power is about somehow defensively entrusting the will, the fortunes of the nation into people who are better informed than the people of the nation. Finally, in terms of symptoms of decline, there is clearly the ideological reconfiguration of European politics in the early 21st century, which probably is too vast a topic to summarize briefly, but clearly here we have not just the decay of long-standing ideologies that had been very successful in creating a bipartisan structure to European politics in much of Europe in the post-war years, social democracy and Christian democracy, But more profound than their decay is about the emergence of what one could call a whole new pole of politics from Maloney through the centre of Europe to the east of Europe, which is about the emergence of something that I really don't want to call populism, but something for which we have not yet found a proper name, a certain spirit of what I think Maloney herself would call a certain sort of patriotic Republican politics. And that politics is not most obviously of the extreme right, whatever its historical antecedents. It has much more to do with a certain new fusion of themes from right and left, particularly about social justice and social welfare, but certainly about the recovery of a certain national sovereignty, and certainly about the privileging of insiders over outsiders. And insiders here might be the sons and daughters of the nation, or the outsiders might be recently arrived groups, or indeed more generally broader transnational or global forces that seem to be threatening the sovereignty of the nation. Now that version, the different versions of that sort of pole of politics seem to me to be very inherent in the success of most political parties in the last 10 years. And I don't think that I see any symptoms that that's about to change. I think it's much more that it's going to be consolidated and integrated. And once you have a whole series of representatives of those forms of politics in power, I don't think we can carry on using dismissive words like populist about them. They are in fact the new establishment. They are the new rulers. And that's going to be a very interesting change, and not one that is likely to reinforce structures of democracy in Europe. It's going to create new versions of semi-authoritarianism. Look towards Serbia, look towards Hungary. These are examples of the extent to which practices of democracy can be offset by new forms of emergency rule that suspend or exclude various political activists. So clearly, with those symptoms of decline, we have a besieged and embattled democracy. But that seems to me to be only one side of the question. And I want to finish today by talking about what I see as the other side of this process in the history of the present. Let's call it my 1848 thesis. Like a lot of people who've taught a lot of courses on 20th century Europe, I'm sort of slightly bored of the obvious historical reference points of 20th century Europe, especially 1945 and so on. 1848, much neglected. Nobody seemed to pay any attention when it got to the 150th anniversary of it. Perhaps some of us will live to see the 200th anniversary of it. It's an event that does not instinctively draw the attention of historians. Chris Clark has recently published a rather good book about it, but he's almost alone in the field. And it was interesting when he came to give a lecture about it in Oxford that he felt he had to do 1848 for idiots. There was an assumption that nobody really would understand about 1848 unless he actually put up a lot of slides and showed us pictures of Louis Philippe and so on. In other words, let me not labour the point, it's not part of the mainstream of how we think about Europe's modern history. But I think we should perhaps start to do so. Imagine that we're in Bologna in 1847, within the Papal States. We might be aware of the evident fragility of the established order, and or perhaps more exactly the lack of resources to support the established order, a certain decrepitude of institutions. But we'd also be aware, in the town squares of this place, above all in a university town, of a whole new political world that was out there that just wasn't interacting with the structures of power. One thinks of literacy that had increased markedly by then, the existence of newspapers as a common daily occurrence in Bologna. One thinks about the pressures for citizenship, the pressures for the vote from a mass audience, not an inclusive audience, but a mass audience of men, and even some voices at this period before gender frontiers had been fully established within politics, of the participation of women too. The people who get described as the crowd in the revolutions of 1848 are simply they're simply being abused with the term of their enemies when that is used. It's a campaign for citizenship, it's a campaign for rights. And the rights, the sort of emancipation template of politics, that is very strong, especially among that Bolshevik group of university students in the 1840s, is a very marked element of European politics at that time. And alongside the emancipation template, you have the liberation template. And liberation in this context, of course, and especially in this city, is about Italian liberation. It's about national sovereignty. It's about the idea that membership or participation in a nation is the way by which you become free. Anybody noticed the similarities between how I described 1848 and how you might describe today? A world of literacy, a world of politics outside of the formal realm. Let's imagine it to be digital. Let's imagine rhetorics of citizenship, from which quite a number of citizens of this city are not able to participate in the current legal framework. A world of rights, and a language of rights and of identity is surely very central to many of the forms of mobilization in 21st century politics. And finally, the language of nation. And one could think of that, of course, in terms of the Italian nation, but one can also think of it, if you let me cheat a little, in terms of the rights of other collective groups. Think about religious communities, ethnic communities, and the like. In a multicultural society, that becomes important as a demand for liberation. So we might have here something which is a bit different from the languages of crisis and decline. We might be describing here something that is being born, but that we are not quite able to see because it doesn't fit in with the templates of 20th century European democracy. New digital spaces, as I described it, certainly new actors, often deeply opportunist, deeply accidental, deeply transient, in that sense that a leader one year is not a leader next year. It's, I think, a very obvious feature of democracy in the 21st century. Big swings of votes, volatility, again described by historians and especially political scientists as a bad thing, is surely the new reality of voting in the 21st century. The voting in most European elections in recent years doesn't really make sense unless you assume that large minorities of citizens are actually changing their votes between one election and another, or more interestingly, also splitting their vote between apparently incompatible political choices at different levels in elections held in the same year. So there's a new discontinuous character to democratic politics in the 21st century. And of course, it adopts languages that we do not like. The we here is, of course, old people like me and him. It's about this sense that a certain political language of the 20th century doesn't really seem at home in a world where where politics is much more direct, often uses rude words, involves certain sorts of rude actions. And I'm not diminishing in any sense the underplay of violence, which I think is much more apparent in Europe in the 21st century now in democratic life than would have been the case in the preceding decades. So there's a sense of a rough and tumble to democratic politics in Europe in the history of the present. And it's not very obvious that this is always going to ending in the right way. But why do we think that democratic politics is always going to end up in the right way? That is to go back to that optimism that I was being grumpy about at the beginning of my talk. It's about a way in which democracy is thought of as being a way by which we end up with the right answer. Well, Brexit might disagree with that, but it's pretty obvious that also in the democratic politics of the 21st century, we might be getting used to the idea of the wrong person winning. And if we're interested in the future of democracy, we do have to understand why the wrong people win, or we have to try to recognize that it's our perspective on this, which is wrong. 1848 here and elsewhere did not, of course, succeed. 1849 is a much more interesting year, because 1849 is the year when the short-lived revolutions of 1848 largely get overthrown in most areas of Europe. They get overthrown by some things which might also be familiar to you, by economic crisis and the fact that by the summer of 1849, quite a lot of people in urban centers in Europe did not have enough to eat, and that were inclined to blame their revolutions for that. By the divisions that developed within the revolutionary forces between different factions or political tendencies and so on, which meant that the construction of stable governments was actually very difficult to achieve, and by two things that might have even more direct and immediate analogies, which is the success of Louis Napoleon in France, being elected as president of the French Second Republic, a man whose sole claim in many ways to being president was the fact that he was the nephew of the other Napoleon, and that he was in other respects a deeply mediocre man, but a man who was presented to the world through the artifice of new forms of visual representation as being somehow the symbol of the French nation, or more exactly of a reborn French empire that would recover the glory of the previous Napoleonic years. It didn't work it worked as a slogan. It didn't work as a form of rule, and he had to resort on the 2nd of December 1851 to the first modern coup in European history, the deployment of a mass army using guns on the streets of France in order to chase revolutionaries out of power and indeed into prison in places like Guyana, as a way of establishing an authoritarian regime. Similarities with today, I wouldn't like to say. And the final element of the similarity with today is that most revolutions in Central Europe, most notably in Hungary, were actually put down not by Hungarians, but by a Russian army that came a long way through Europe and came pretty close to Paris in 1849 in terms of an army of counter-revolutionary order that sought to rescue various crowned heads of Europe from the folly of their own weakness, which had led to the revolutions in the first place. So a certain sort of Russian-sponsored or Tsarist-sponsored order then became a way by which the revolutions of 1848 were put in their place. So what we have here is not exactly my 1848 thesis guaranteeing the emergence of a new world of democracy, and certainly not a world of democracy that we will like. We've got to get used to a much more bumpy form of democracy that will probably be discontinuous, probably much challenged, and will probably end up in lots of the wrong people winning. Thank you very much.
I would invite people online to use the chat function and send messages. I have got approximately 342 questions of my own. I better not abuse the chair by asking them. I throw it open to you. Just state your name, where you're from. Anybody? Yes, please.
Hi, my name is this thing on?
Yeah.
Yep.
Hi, my name is Arjun Joshi. I'm a first-year master's student here. I'm from the US originally. And I'd wanted to ask, while there have obviously been very real democratic recessions around the world, Trump's re-election, the Reform Party in the UK, you name many others.
Yeah.
But I was curious how you reconcile that with what would seem to be resilience in democracy, or what would be almost resurgences in certain points. Bolsonaro got indicted in Brazil. The BJP lost some ground in the legislature in India. And there are a couple other instances, or at the very least, noticeable lack of turns to the hard right in Mexico or Canada.
Yeah.
So I was curious if you had any thoughts on that, whether there's connections, or if, these seem to be a little bit more isolated instances.
Can I just take 2-3 questions? Dana next, and then.
Oh, well, let me remember what I've just been asked.
Yeah, taking notes. Dana, then Evan, and then Tutor.
Hi, I'm Dana Allen, an adjunct faculty here, living in Britain. And I came in late and I have to leave early, so this is going to be.
I'll get him in my response quick.
Completely
I remembered that.
Ignorant question based on that, so not having heard anything. But the idea that the revolution 2048 advance is about the wrong people winning. I mean, it strikes me that that does seem to be happening, challenging a lot of elite liberal pieties and expectations, and maybe this Whig version of European history that you were talking about. But I just wonder in specific terms, because you were elusive without being completely specific about who you were talking about. So, for example, Brexit. Brexit wasn't a person. It wasn't the wrong person. And in fact, it isn't very popular in Britain. And, you know, so, you know, I'm just, does that express the sort of this exclusion of the wrong thing, or was it incompetence on the part of the Conservative Party that was trying to deal with a long-standing issue that it had, and it was just mismanagement? Because, I mean, you spoke of referenda in sort of positive terms, but not everything has to be subject to a referendum to be democratic. And then I'm just wondering if, you know, specifically you would comment on Vance's, you know, démarche that you have to work with the AfD because I'm not sure why, but well, yeah, but the interesting thing is no one's preventing the AfD from winning elections. They're just saying we're going to band together and to put on another program. So that's what.
Okay, thanks, David. Evan, and then
Then we'll pause.
okay, and then after that, Tutor, please. Evan.
Yeah, this is maybe less of a question and more of a theme, so apologies for that. But I'm very curious if you've thought about this thesis in relation to incipient population decline in the West, particularly if you're thinking about this maybe reemergence of a more nationalist politics, a focus on the in-group. How can that be squared with what very clearly looks like approaching demographic catastrophe that cannot really be solved without migration? Or at least I haven't really heard too many other alternatives or viable alternatives put forth on the table yet.
Okay, so we'll have these three questions, and then don't worry, I'm going to get to other people. Can somebody ask a cheerful question? I'm getting depressed.
The first question was cheerful, wasn't it? About the extent to which, and I agree with you, you know, that there's been a whole series of democratic processes, and I would particularly focus, I guess, on India and Mexico in this respect, which demonstrate the extent to which the socially embedded practice of democracy and the desire to create somehow a better polity is very much present all over the place. Where I would probably beg to differ slightly is the degree to which we should therefore assume that that is about the right people winning and therefore the wrong people win in Europe. It seems to me that we might be able, with a little imagination, to think of quite a lot of similarities between the sort of people who win in India and Mexico and the people who might be winning in Germany or whatever. You know, they're not very different, and that's part of the problem in my mind, is that I still think in terms of a left-right dichotomy, which I don't think is very helpful to me. And I think that what's interesting is the extent to which the new mobilizatory politics that one might talk about, rather than to avoid using the democracy word, that sort of new mobilizatory politics actually has quite a lot of similarities in different regions of the world, though it's quite obvious that there's a particular temper to democracy in Europe, which is not necessarily reflected elsewhere, without in any way implying a European superiority. Brexit is about the wrong people winning. It's not about people winning. It's about a cause winning. It's about obviously taking back control. It's about ordinary people somehow taking back control, not so much from Brussels as from Westminster. That's about a form of bottom-up mobilization, which may have had many, many accidental causes, not least the rather chaotic rules that governed the referendum. And yes, indeed, it's true that the outcome of the referendum is one that would be unlikely to be repeated if it was to happen again. But great disasters happen for good reasons. And I tend to be of the camp that overinterpret the outcome of the Brexit referendum rather than dismissing it, which is to see it as a particular bankruptcy of a particular way of doing politics in the UK. And I don't think that what's happened with the SNP in Scotland or with the arrival of Starmer in power in England is particularly a demonstration that this is all being put back together again in a complicated way, in a coherent way. And obviously the demise of the British Isles as a sort of functioning political polity is something that, as a Welshman, I've long welcomed. But I think that, you know, what's interesting about this is clearly that it was a false movement led by a bunch of rogues, probably funded by all sorts of other people who we can't quite see, And in that sense, yes, it is absolutely the wrong outcome, and it was not policed or administered in the proper way. But as an example of how politics goes wrong, I think it's a very instructive one for the 21st century. And if nothing else, it saved everybody else from thinking about holding a referendum on European Union membership. You know, we used to hear about Frexit or Nexit and these sort of journalistic inventions. Well, they're not going to happen anytime soon, are they? Vance lecturing people at the Munich Security Conference on democracy and about the lack of freedom in Europe. It was particularly the word freedom, which is, of course, a particularly Trumpian term. It's about freedom of choice, particularly on issues of ethical dilemmas and so on. It's clearly something which a good number of Americans take seriously. Vance is probably not one of them. You know, he was probably engaged in a deeply opportunist attempt to try and win the Republican nomination in 2028. But let's not get away from the fact that clearly he was actually daring to suggest that Europeans weren't very good in the 2020s at doing democracy, and that perhaps they had something to learn from other places. We may not share his view of the other places, but are we not going to pause and think that there was something in what he was saying which gives us room for thinking that actually this democratic model is a bit precarious and is not one simply to celebrate? Population decline, yes. Big demographic trend of the 21st century is clearly the long-term decline in population within Europe and the emergence of substantial, significant minorities of people who are essentially recent arrivals in Europe from elsewhere. This is now a Europe which will have in many of its major cities people who, if you were to adopt an ethnic dimension, you might say are non-European majorities. That's great, by the way. And that's also something that gives cause for hope in terms of demography and the rest, but it's also something that's very particularly challenging for a model of European democracy that was often tacitly white in the way in which it thought about how democracy was practiced. And I think that one of the elements of my 1848 fantasy would be about how that sort of politics might be about also a white-led politics being replaced by something that is much more really multicultural than has been the case so far.
Professor Cordell first.
Okay.
How many PhDs does it
Okay,
take to
in
switch on the
fact,
mic?
so
Okay.
I'm a professor of economics, so this allows me to make a very naive question. What is your definition of democracy?
We will just move around. Other questions, please? Here in the middle.
Hi, my name is Julian. I'm one of Professor Gilbert's students, and I hope he doesn't mind me asking this question because it happens to be one of the questions for our final. And is
That's all right. I can always change it.
but it's our democracies inherently fragile, and like, do you think how does that play into your picture of the 1848?
You have to wonder what one of the sources for my question was. But yes, over here, Martin.
Hi, thank you. My name is Martina, and I'm an Italian student. I wanted to ask you, when there is like discontent or a crisis in a democracy, do you think that the first thing that comes is like a crisis in the culture of democracy? So, for example, pluralism or participation, accountability, or a crisis in the institutions, or what you said about more power in the executive. Do you think that one of these things comes first, or are they like, do they go together?
Yeah. Okay, next three. Right.
Okay, well, I'll start with that because, yes, I think it's impossible to create some sort of law about all these sort of things, but I find the symptoms of a kind of, well, I don't want to use the word crisis. It's a symptom of a dissatisfaction with democratic processes is much more apparent in the cultural realm than it is in the political realm. And I think that there's a kind of in the sort of mature political regimes that we have in Western Europe, there's a certain time lag before discontents in society express themselves in the discontents in the ballot box. I think we've seen transitions towards that now happening. But I think if you were to go back 10 years, you would find much more outspoken discontent with the political elites in the cultural realm than you would have found in the more formal political realm. And in that sense, I think that the cultural effervescence of much of Europe in the last 10 years has not always been pretty in terms of the way various forms of old prejudice have returned to this, become visible once again in European society. But that effervescence also has an energy and an evident desire on the part of groups that might have felt that they had no place in public political debate to make their views felt. In Oxford in history, we had a great fuss about Cecil Rhodes and Rhodes Must Fall, the South African imperialist who donated a lot of money to Oxford in the early 20th century, about 5 or 6 years ago. And the history faculty in its piety had the very good idea, I was running it at the time, to hold a teach-in about Cecil Rhodes and all that. And we got something like 250 people in the room, and, you know, we had to find a bigger room and all the rest of it. And there was a real passion in the room, and it was great. And it was really stimulating for all who were there, not particularly in terms of the coherence of the outcomes, but in terms of the energy of the inputs. So we thought, that's great, let's hold it again. And we held it again the next term. And I think it was 8 people turned up, you know, and that is about the discontinuous nature of these sort of mobilizations, which often are taking place. They're sort of crowd phenomena that might happen online and then manifest themselves briefly in the real world, so to speak, and then they go away. And they're not, these people have not lapsed into indifference about all that, but they've probably moved on in terms of how they actually think about their cultural engagement with the issues of the time. And perhaps they move on to other issues, or they find a different way of expressing their interest in the same issue. That sort of discontinuous mobilization that might happen more easily in the cultural realm seems to be more characteristic of our times than might have been the case 30 or so years ago. Julian, I'm not sure I know the answer to your essay question about democracies being inherently fragile. The obvious place for any historian to go is to say it depends what you mean by fragile. Political regimes can be overthrown.
Martin, can I just interrupt you 1 second? You see what I mean about interrogating questions?
Yeah, right. And fragility clearly takes 3 or 4 forms. You know, it could be institutional fragility, rhetorical fragility, and so on. I don't want to suggest the paragraph structure for you, but there's but once you've got to the end of writing those paragraphs, what does one write as the final paragraph? Because it's quite obvious that you could therefore say, and this would not get a very good mark, you know, that therefore I have proven that democracies are inherently fragile. What would be more interesting is actually to wonder whether the metaphor of fragility, which is a metaphor, it's not a reality, you know, is actually a very useful way of approaching the whole phenomenon of political regimes. Nobody thought that the Soviet dictatorship, of what we recall it, was fragile until it was thrown over. And nobody tended to think that France in 1789 was suddenly going to lose its monarchy or whatever. So these things are things that often prove to happen more quickly than any list of causes would suggest. And I think that would be the more useful way of thinking about it. It's the inherent unpredictability of time frames and of outcomes, which seems more interesting than indices of fragility. The naive question about what we mean by democracy is, of course, the one that follows what we mean by fragility, isn't it? Look, historians don't like broad cross-cultural definitions like that. They would much more prefer to say, what did democracy mean in particular places, let's call it Europe, at particular moments in, say, the later 20th century. And I think when I've wrote this book about democracy, I was very keen to emphasize that we need to think of democracy as a series of rather consecutive models that perhaps don't have as much to do with each other as is often alleged. So there might have been, I'll be brief, something like 4 or 5 regimes of democracy in Europe since the French Revolution. Obviously, the revolutionary template, the parliamentary template and the sort of enfranchisement that developed in most European states across the second half of the 19th century into the early 20th century. And then the development of a certain sort of quasi-populist authoritarian mass democracy that you might associate with the Nazis or with Stalin or with the people's democracies in Eastern Europe after 1930 or so. And then finally, then the development of particular regimes of representative democracy in Western Europe and after 1989 in Eastern Europe. I suppose my subject today has been about actually trying to draw some of the contours of what a fifth regime of democracy might look like. And I find that sense of actually a series of different regimes of democracy. One might throw in the differentness of somewhere like Mexico and India into this equation as well, is going to be my perfect way of avoiding answering your question.
Right, further questions? Okay, Grant had his hand up first, then first Grant, yeah.
There's another one there.
Yeah, sorry.
Thanks a lot for the very interesting talk. I'm an associate fellow here for the last few months. I'm normally at the University of Nottingham in Ningbo, China. I just have a question about the roots of the discontent. I'm wondering if it's can be found in the impression that peoples have that democracy isn't successful enough anymore. It isn't delivering a better quality of life anymore. I'm just struck by how in the US, there's a lot of discontent and it seems to be based on how the system isn't working for people anymore. It was striking how during the Biden administration, how, the people kept on saying, the economy is pretty good, and you should be happy. But people weren't happy. And people in the UK don't seem to be content with their quality of life. People in continental Europe, if we still use that term, don't seem content with the quality of life that democracy is delivering. And also elites look globally and they see the rising non-Western great and regional powers. And it seems like democracy isn't delivering globally either. Challenges everywhere. And yet, most of the democratic systems that we talk about are delivering pretty good qualities of life. Standards of living are high in most of these places and continue to improve. Rights continue to improve. There's lots of reasons to be positive, but it seems to me that the people don't believe that democracy is successful anymore. I was just wondering what you think about that as the root of the discontent.
Thank you. Anne next, then Sumaya, please.
Hey, this is perhaps an unfair question on twofold. One, it's about the United States, and you clearly focused on Europe during your presentation. And two, you're a historian, and I'm going to ask you about the future. But if you were a betting man, what would you say the next 10 years of democracy in the United States would look like, given current trends and what you've observed from historical trends?
If I can just interrupt there, there's a very old joke among historians, which is that economists and political scientists do prediction, whereas forecasting, whereas we do retrocasting, but we have the satisfaction of more often being right. But Karen.
Oops, okay. Hello, my name is Sumaya. I'm also a professor. Well, I was in both of Professor Gilbert's classes. And I study multiculturalism in my research. And this ties to your question. One of the main things I think about when it comes to roots of discontent, a lot of people feeling disenfranchised, unrepresented. And one idea that we speak up in professor's class is, well, in democracy, not everyone will be happy, tyranny of the majority, these types of concepts. But my question within the sphere of multiculturalism is, do you think that Europe will be forced to adapt to this growing multiculturalism, specifically since they're more multi-ethnic European citizens in a lot of countries such as like France, Germany, UK, Netherlands, etc. And this is the new norm. I mean, the movement of peoples to some degree now has, it's irreversible. We're in a post-colonial, globalized world and things are changing. So do you think that this shift in dynamics, the Europeans can resist it for as long as they'd like, but now we're seeing the responses and what it's causing, which is actually negative impact both economically and socially for everyone in the society, right? So do you think that this will lead to an inevitable response of Europeans to actually adapt to multiculturalism?
Great. Well, again, I'll pick up that one first, if I may, and I'll get back to the others. The word that I had trouble swallowing in what you just said was about Europeans being forced to adapt to multiculturalism. I don't think that's a likely recipe for success, but I think that the force of demographic change and of economic changes and what we used to call globalization, that perhaps not quite as dead as it's being announced to be, that is clearly going to create a much more pluralist European society, and the idea of a kind of norm of being what a European is clearly diminishing quite quickly and will continue to diminish. And again, let me emphasize that that's actually a very good process. It's about the erosion of certain racialized hierarchies in European society that we're all too keen to see in other areas such as the United States, but are not enough in our own. The question then becomes, for me, I suppose it's a sense that the word multiculturalism isn't really the adequate term to describe this. It's about the emergence of a new sort of polity, which must have inherently very plural and probably uneven structures of participation. The idea, which is dear to a lot of French Republican thinkers, of that you have to create a kind of homogenous citizenship, is clearly not going to work in the 21st century, and that you have to embrace differentness and to accept differentness and find different ways by which different groups in the population can participate in the political process. And that means actually doing rather complicated things, probably about rejecting certain forms of uniform constitutional structures and actually constructing more exceptions and more forms of localism and more forms of acceptance of, for example, the presence of religious ideas in civil life. Now, do all that, and you might be getting towards what I imagine you rather thinking might come into existence within 10 years. The problem is, of course, that at least even the modest steps in that direction over the last 15 years have produced an awful lot of reaction against it. So the progress is not going to come without the reaction. And can we predict which one of those will win? I think probably it will be a rather bloody draw. And that's probably one of the ways in which one can be a bit negative about what may happen, which is, of course, to come to the question about the future. The interesting thing about betting is that a horse that had the same name as my son won the Grand National in Liverpool on Saturday afternoon, and both my wife and I had at some point that day said, well, we must put a bet on it. It was at 33 to 1, and it would have made me so rich I wouldn't have had to come here. So I'm not a betting man in that way, but I think that what I was hoping to convey through what I spoke about is that Trump is not part of a separate story. Trump is a version of a certain form of bottom-up politics that is unlikely to produce great answers and solutions in the United States, but is likely to sort of inspire passions over the coming years, and is probably going to set a model for whoever comes after him, which it will be difficult for anybody to undo. And that sort of maximalist term regime change might be what in some ways is also happening in more disguised ways within other areas of Europe. And so I think that the prediction I simply want to make would be that actually we're going to arrive at much more nuanced structures of democracy and authoritarianism, whereby perhaps regimes will cease to be quite as democratic as we think they used to be, but will not become the authoritarian ogre that we might imagine could await us. Instead, in the 21st century, surely we're going to live with a whole gamut of regimes that don't seem to come from the same sort of recipe book, and that don't seem to indicate a single model of democracy, or indeed a full model of democracy. What I predicted with my 1848 analogy is clearly that the outcome of those sort of processes is going to be mixed across different areas of Europe. the roots of discontent lying in the fact that democracy is not seen to be delivering for people. One might say that in many ways Europe, democracy has never really delivered for people. What's interesting again is the perception that it's not delivering. The economy is doing well, but somehow we're not getting rich. Others are getting rich. It's all unfair. The sort of sense of it being about no delivery of what people want. For me, those are all ways of thinking and ways of talking that are sincere, but they reflect a much broader dysfunction of the transmission belts between what people think rulers should be doing and what rulers think people should be experiencing. And it is that it's that those evident blockages in the system in terms of how people express their aspirations, perfectly respectable aspirations and perfectly disrespectful aspirations, and how those in power, in the broadest sense, actually respond to them, which seems to be the most interesting feature of this current crisis with democracy, which, as you rightly said, is not actually about somehow everything getting worse, and it's not actually about indices of misery. Those of us who, back in the bad old days, did quite a lot of work on the rise of Nazism. It was never the people who were actually suffering most in the Weimar Republic who voted for the NSDAP. I exaggerate a little. It was the people who felt a certain sort of differential failure vis-a-vis others, which were much more available, shall we say, for voting for the NSDAP. And that might be something that one sees replicated in some of the voting patterns of the present day.
Another round, please, my friend with the mustache.
Okay, hi, I'm Luigi. I'm an Italian student here. So I was wondering what's your view on the supposed EU's democratic deficit and whether EU supranational governance is a departure from classical, traditional, notional democracy, representative democracy we all know about.
Is that a question request from Professor Frizzi?
It's another essay question, right?
Yes, please, Professor Frizzi.
Martin, of the 4 points that you mentioned at the beginning,
Mhm.
saying, okay, we know the answer to this question, does democracy breed discontent? Just wanted you to maybe elaborate a little bit more on this concept of contested legality.
Okay, one more question, and then I'm going to abuse my position as chair as for the last questions. Anybody? At the back, right at the back. I can't see who it is. Hello, Courtney.
Hi, my name is Courtney. So in Professor Gilbert's democracy class. So you mentioned a little bit about the decline of civil participation and parliaments not really serving people the way that they used to. And I guess I'm curious where you see a role for agency of the people now. So we've talked a little bit in our class about like civil education. Is there room for that? I'm American, maybe you can tell from my accent, but we've seen a lot of protests happening across the United States in the last weekend. And perhaps some Republican politicians are changing changing what they think. So I'm curious what you see as, agency for the people, if that's another way to bolster democracy as we know it, or if we're kind of stuck with electing the right people. Thank you.
Good. Well, I'll go with the first one this time, which was Luigi on the EU democratic deficit. Yes, well, of course, it's interesting when people begin to notice a democratic deficit, which had always been there. And suddenly, from about the 1990s onwards, people started talking about this as a way of basically giving voice to their other forms of discontent with the EU. The democratic deficit was, of course, a very deliberate element of the EU because so much of the structure of democracy as it was created in Western Europe after 1945 was about making sure that there were sufficient barriers between the people and the making of policy. It always had to be channeled through representative formal institutions. And the EU became this multinational body that stood above national democracies, where an even higher level of rationality could be brought into decision-making, especially when it was conducted in large concrete buildings in Brussels with very thick walls. And it's that sense of a kind of managed democracy that was so inherent to the EU project, which made it a very successful product of its time. Let's not get away from that. This is a remarkable success story of the emergence of a particular structure of the EU that initially had really rather modest gains, but by the time Delors is the president of the Commission in the 1990s, it's really rushing ahead in a very particular way. And then it stops. You know, and the political space for that sort of multinational organization clearly doesn't exist in the same way that it did before. And the ambitions of the EU have become progressively more modest over the same period and, for example, have eschewed largely any further expansion of the frontiers of the European Union. So that the whole phrase democratic deficit is something that one could turn into a form of praise of the sort of managed democracy of the later 20th century, or one could see my hinge analogy as being a way by which we express our discontent with the democracies of the present. Contested legality, I don't know. I wasn't intending to say that, but talking to you over lunch made me think that I should put in something about legality and constitutions and so on. So let's say it was not the most considered element of my presentation. I did want to just bring out this Janus-faced element to it, which is that on the one hand, many people seem much more eager to bring legality into democracy and to turn the practice of democracy into a legally supervised process. The extent to which people rush to start litigation about all sorts of things that you might have regarded as actually a project subjects for democratic debate rather than for any judgment by a lawyer, be they intelligent or unintelligent, you know, in particular courts of law. So I wanted to emphasize that. And then at the other time, I wanted to emphasize the extent to which the lawyers might not be the winners of any sort of process of change, because actually the prestige of law as a management vehicle in European and I think North American societies at present seems to be diminished considerably by the extent to which quite a lot of people are actually, and I don't just think of Trump in this respect, are actually much more critical of the way in which lawyers are not actually listening to the people. Now, that sort of language can sound slightly frightening or ignorant, but I think it's expressive of a way in which it's not just democratic structures that have to change, but processes of civil and constitutional law that have to change. Corny's, yeah, agency of the people. Yeah, can't read my own handwriting. Yeah, that's interesting. My 1848 analogy, of course, you know, immediately suggests that actually the future of European democracy lies with crowds, because that's who won in 1848. I think that the era of crowds, and I said this in answer to a previous question, might have been replaced by an era of rather discontinuous mass flood mobilizations in digital spaces and so on. And that seems a more likely way by which things are challenged. Is Trump going to be the first ruler to be overthrown by Facebook? By which I mean by a kind of mass mobilization in the digital sphere, which somehow exposes him to such ridicule that rather like the Communist Party leaders in 1988 or 1989, somehow he had to accept that really, unless you were Ceausescu, you really should just run away rather than trying to confront the will of the crowd. There's elements of that about it, and I find that more, what do? I find that slightly more interesting because it's more novel than the evident mobilization of crowds in American cities, which I'm sure will gather pace over the coming months and may even begin to invade or to mobilize elements of Trump's own core constituency, which will cause Republicans who are wondering about the next congressional election to begin to change their spots. No surprise there. It's always been thus and it always will be. But I think that the extent to which we're going to see a 6th of January 2021 by the other side is, I think, slightly unlikely.
Okay, I'm now going to start on my 381 questions. Actually, I'm not. I'm just going to ask one question, Martin. I mean, first of all, thank you for an amazingly stimulating talk. I want to ask you a question about the breakdown of European democracy in general, the problems that we've had, and the lack of self-reflection of what you call the BMW generation. I don't know when you invented that. I'm going to use that with all kinds of people I don't like, particularly in future conferences. But
Don't attribute it to me.
oh no, of course I should do that. I mean, it's only correct to correct. But the point.
Mohammed and I will never speak in Germany again.
Right. Yeah, I know. Yeah, there was of course also that. But of course, you were talking about. I mean, in the West. Right, let's do potted history. In the West, we evolved something after World War II that we could, as you rightly said, was much stronger than people give credit for, which you can broadly describe as social democracy, which was acquiesced in by Christian Democrats, right? I mean, it's roughly right. If you think about it, a thing that's always struck me, I mean, just having finished the book on Alcide de Gasperi, is how similar he was to Rat Butler. Yeah. And how similar both of them were to certain forms of democratic socialism. So we evolved this, and my argument would be, let me just put this to you, that we had a society that delivered unprecedented social justice. And this was true in some ways, even in the people's democracies. And at the same time, there was a remnant of traditional respect for institutions, for seniority. There was this kind of conservative glue holding the societies together. Do you think the cause of the breakdown of the democracy, of the democratic defects that we're seeing, are something of a combination of neoliberalism on the one hand, and I could not but help you finished your golden age of democracy in 68 to 70 with the challenge of 1968 to deference towards authority?
What I'm looking for is my riposte to this idea that de Gasperi was like Rat Butler, because I went to see the vast, enormous statue that none of you will be able to see of de Gasperi, which has been established, built in his hometown of Trento.
It's in my book.
Yeah, I don't think that any British politician would have had a 100-foot statue to the glory of his life works constructed in his hometown.
But de Gasperi wouldn't have either. It was done deliberately by his heirs.
By his enemies.
Never
was it, to
agreed to it,
discredit
trust me.
him. Oh, I see. Right. Okay. But I will take your much wider point, which is that there's a clear convergence of civic and social norms in Europe after 1945 in Western Europe around the model of a rather careful democracy, which you might describe as a certain sort of post-traumatic stress disorder, that having lived through completely disrupted, chaotic, dangerous, and often bereaved lives over the previous 10 years, there's an extent to which his European populations take refuge in something that they call normality, which actually wasn't a normality, but it was something that they wanted to hold to. And the predictability of life and the emergence, for example, of structures of welfare and of health provision that perhaps took away some of the most immediate dangers of life in terms of childhood death or in terms of the impoverishment of illness and disability. Those are things which clearly made a great deal of sense for most Europeans in the post-1945 period, and anybody who wanted to win elections in Europe over the subsequent 30 or so years had to do that. At the same time, there was an interesting convergence on a certain sort of, let me call it soft Catholicism, of a certain sort of morality that had a greater audience than the audience who went into churches, and a convergence on a certain form of civic politeness. Paul Betts has written interestingly about this in the German Federal Republic, that actually people didn't have to get to their feet when somebody of importance came into the room by the 1960s. You know, that there was that sort of deference to a certain social order was replaced by a more democratic politeness and by a sense of wanting to listen to people and being willing to listen to people, which is reflected too in the rather careful presentation by many political leaders of being normal people. People who have a football team, people who have families and children. They're not somehow people above the population. They're people who operate within the population. And those sort of norms that you describe seem to me to be a very real way in which the democratic structures in Western Europe after 1945 acquired a greater key word for me, I suppose, of legitimacy. legitimacy is not about popularity. It's about nevertheless accepting that the regime you have is in broad terms the right regime. And that sort of legitimacy seems to me to be a better description of attitudes to democracy than somehow everybody being a fan of democracy. Now, legitimacy is a fragile thing, perhaps, and what's quite clear from the 1970s and 80s onwards is that things such as neoliberalism begin to diminish it. Also, the failure somehow to be perceived to be delivering ongoing prosperity for Europeans is important. The neoliberalism thing is not some evil trick visited on naive Europeans by I don't know, Chicago school economists or whatever. It's much more about many Europeans growing out of a culture where they felt themselves too dependent on state provision, and particularly too dependent on the regimes of high taxation. And therefore the popularity, not among the whole population, but among influential demographic groups, of a certain sort of individualism as being the better way to live, is an important value shift that one sees in the Berlusconi years, but you also see then in Thatcherism in the UK and so on. And that, I don't think that's neoliberalism with a capital N and a capital L. It's much more about a value shift away from seeing democracy as about provision, and people developing a rather crucial word, perhaps, a more transactional approach to democracy, that they will engage in democracy if they see something coming out of the other end of that process that benefits them, by which I don't mean just an individual, but perhaps their family, their community, the people they're close to. And that sort of transactional approach describes, I think, something slightly less extreme than some neoliberal revolution, but a real shift of values that I think is probably ongoing in Italy.
But what about 1968? I can't resist pushing you on that.
Yeah, 1968 is one of those years we should forget about. 1967 and 69 were much more interesting. 68 is one of those cliches from the photo book of the later 20th century. What's interesting about it is presumably that it actually radicalized certain elite intellectual groups into thinking indifferently about European society and developing critiques of it, particularly an espousal of causes from the global south, and indeed some of the neoliberal ideas that have come to the fore 20-odd years later. So in that sense, it might be some destabilizing of a post-war regime of norms, but the idea that throwing pavé at French policemen in 1968 really changed people's attitude to politics. I mean, most obviously, it made people not like students.
Yeah. God forbid. Well, I can just like to thank Martin for a brilliant and stimulating talk, and thank you for all coming and asking so many questions.